Your piece, Les, cites some survey data about trust in nonprofits. Are polls and surveys, I know you have some thoughts on this, are polls and surveys themselves to be trusted in this context, or what can we make of them?
Trust but verify, to quote President Reagan. Uh, you know, polls have been around for quite a while, and they do tell us something that we didn't know before if they're done well, but you also have to understand what they're saying and not just, and I'm referring not just to things like sampling error and so on. Let's take the trust polls. Usually the question is, do you trust whatever the institution is? And the person filling out the poll registers on a scale that might run from 1 to 9 or something like that, how much trust they have. When the poll is published, though, depending on the who's publishing it, usually just the top and bottom part. So it might be those who rate 1 or 2 are deemed to be very distrusting, and those that are 8 and 9 are trusting. Well, the bulk of the people fall in between,
Yeah.
right on the scale. It is what we call in the social sciences a bell curve, and but that's not reported. You'll see trust or distrust, but it's not really binary. The other interesting thing is the word trust means something to you, it might mean something different to me, and something else to somebody who might be watching this. The word you use, we know, matters. One of the polls on trust in nonprofits was interesting. I forget what year it was, but they had 2 questions. One asked about trust in nonprofits, and the other asked about confidence in nonprofits. They produced different results.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you just have to be aware of what the poll says. As a general rule, trends are more important than one off polls. But even so, it really is worth a good consumer of this kind of data has to look closely at how it's been put together.
Mhm. Okay, Les, what is the paradox of nonprofit trustworthiness?
Well, the paradox is that throughout our history, going back even before we became a country, we've had a great deal of admiration for the role of philanthropy and charities in American life. In some ways, it's been a defining characteristic of Americans. Arthur Schlesinger Sr. wrote a famous article in the 1930s calling the United States a nation of joiners. It's part of our self interest, indeed. It's one of the major reasons why the United States is an exceptional nation. We rely heavily on charity and philanthropy to act in the public good. But at the same time, philanthropy and charity are important to us. We're also distrusting of it. We're skeptical of the motives of organizations that claim to be operating out of the public good. We may be critical of how they do it, as well as why they do it. And we ultimately may wonder what results they're achieving and who they're affecting. So the paradox is we hold 2 different views simultaneously about philanthropy and charity. We like them, we think highly of them, but we also are somewhat skeptical about them. One other element of this, of course, is that we also think that philanthropy and charities have a degree of independence that governments beholden to voters and businesses beholden to consumers don't have. And therefore, they could act not only in the public interest, but innovatively, that they could tackle problems or approaches to dealing with problems that may not necessarily be popular or could command consumer support, but might in the end prove worthwhile. So, in some sense, when a nonprofit or a philanthropy tries to act in that way, it breeds mistrust. Why are you following such a crazy way to deal with, let's take an example where this actually occurred, AIDS, okay, or education, vouchers for schools. Isn't that a crazy thing to do? It will destroy public education. Well, as you well know, a lot of us think not. And fortunately, there are foundations, there are nonprofits that stand behind that kind of approach to education and are willing to try it in Milwaukee and elsewhere. Uh, so the paradox is the kind of love-hate relationship mixed in with the reality that good philanthropy, good nonprofit activity sometimes does produce distrust, but for a reason.
This is a good, healthy paradox, isn't it? You're
Yeah,
making an observation, not a criticism of it. This is,
exactly right.
you should embrace it. Right.
Right. No, I mean, we have to live with it. It's hard for people to live with because, you'll find people prominent in public life these days, like Vice President Vance, criticizing foundations or large endowments at university as kind of hedge funds. And there's some truth to that. But it's also the case that when you have a large endowment, you're free to do some things that you couldn't do if you were dependent on going with the begging bowl every day trying to solicit money.
Hmm. This might be another version of the same question, though. But does the experimentation include should it, could it, would it, partisan? I'm trying to liken the Ford activity in Cleveland to, well, what some think might have been going on with the Center for Tech and Civic, like the Zuck Bucks election administration. Uh, if you're going to embrace the paradox, you also have to allow for instances where the populist uprising against what.
Yes, I know, and I'm not alone in this. When I first began work for a foundation that had a strong interest in public policy, my boss at the time, the president of the foundation, Randy Richardson, on my very first day at work, said, "Look, we want you to try to support some innovative approaches to public policy." But then he went on to say, "I've lived through four congressional investigations in my lifetime, and I don't want to do the sorts of things that would provoke another one." You have to understand that if you're living in the public arena, as foundations and nonprofits inevitably are, you are open to criticism and indeed a legal action, including congressional investigation. So one has to exercise, a degree of prudence. That means doesn't mean you shouldn't take risks, but be cautious about which ones you do. And, don't think that criticisms are in any way illegitimate. It's part of what goes on.
Yeah. Tocqueville's writings didn't include Tocqueville's platoons were not tax exempt, and his writings
Tocqueville's
include,
were, but Tocqueville,
well, the writings don't include the little legal section symbols and C346, all the. I guess I'm asking the same question again, but one could.
but the point about Tocqueville is an important one because Tocqueville really valued the independence of charities. My hunch is he would be appalled at the degree to which charities, both through the tax system as well as through grants and contracts, have become dependent
Yeah.
on their relationship with the public sector. Indeed, uh, when Tocqueville wrote Democracy in America, what he was also doing was trying to understand why the ideals of democracy managed to succeed in the United States, but failed so miserably in his native France. Anyone who reads Democracy in America also ought to read the book that Tocqueville wrote many years afterward on the French Revolution, in which he puts his finger as one of the real causes of the failure of the French Revolution, what he calls administrative centralization. Too much, in other words, had to be run through the bureaucracy and monarchy. And as a result, the system was brittle and just not have the flexibility to adjust to what was going on in the country.
And has the professionalization of, I'll say, philanthropy, the nonprofit sector, both, I guess, with philanthropy in the sector, that
Yeah.
runs the risk of becoming like, being like already, I guess, that which Tocqueville was criticizing there.
Exactly.
Okay, what can be done about it? How's that for a good 30 seconds less? But do the terms of the '69 Act need to be revisited, strengthened? What do we, is Doge okay to be kind of firing away, or what can be done? What should be done?
Well, I think, first of all, trimming back on the amount of government aid going to nonprofits will be painful, but may in the end work out well. That was actually the experience of the Reagan years, when President Reagan sought to cut back somewhat on grants and contracts. I think also a lot of the factors that will affect philanthropy in the future will depend on large scale social and economic changes. If in fact the economy resumes prosperity without inflation, it'll be good for philanthropy. And philanthropy needs to recognize that. Ultimately, philanthropy and nonprofits are part of the private sector. There's not, I mean, there's a lot of loose talk about a third sector that's neither government nor business. Well, philanthropy is always part of the private sector. There's not a third sector. And its future will depend on the degree in which public policy, as well as social attitudes, favor a healthy, growing private sector. And there are a variety of ways to think about that, including questions about, is there a revival of religion going on? Another interesting one, we know we have a larger proportion of immigrants in our society now. Leave aside their legal status for this moment. But typically, when people come to the United States from another country, they don't bring with them the same ideas about philanthropy and nonprofits we have. But over a generation or two, they develop them. And the question is whether we are going to see, we're already seeing some signs of it, for example, in the Hispanic community, growing interest in charity in the Asian community, especially in the Indian, subcontinental Indian community. Is that going to continue, and will that give a revival in a different form to American philanthropy?
Mhm. Well, unless you have something to add, Les, or want to ask yourself a question that I didn't, I think we can maybe end there.
Looks good to me. Let me just the other thing while we're on talking about Tocqueville,
Yeah.
is Tocqueville fully understood the connection between civic associations and political associations. In fact, he says in Democracy, writes Democracy in America, political associations are the perfection of civic associations, by which he doesn't mean that they are better. What he means is that after you've tried and tried and tried through civic associations, you may reach a point where you need to organize politically to accomplish your goal. You want safer streets or improved environment or what have you, and you've reached a point where doing this through civic associations has limits. At that point, you might choose to be more political about it. So this connection has always been understood.
Mhm. Mhm. In line with what I'll call here the principle of subsidiarity. I'm giving you
Yes,
the way Mike Joyce would have thought of it.
right.
And I want to adhere. I'm reaching now on exemption and subsidization of viewpoints with which you disagree. The political association, fixing the sidewalk needn't be done even politically with exemption helping along the way.
Exactly. In
Right.
fact, it's now as a result of the 2017 Tax Act.
Yeah.
Um, Less than 10% of tax-paying households itemize their deductions and benefit from deductibility. Exemption remains important. Exemption meaning that organizations don't pay tax on their net income. But I think there are a lot of good questions being raised about that. For example, a big university endowment essentially invests its money, like any other investor does. Should it be pay some version of tax on its net investment income? Well, the 2017 Tax Act answered that affirmatively. Major and university endowments now do pay a small tax. Should that be broadened? What are the consequences? Those are good questions to discuss.
Right. Well, let's give you, Les Lenkowsky, the rest of the day off after thanking you for doing this with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.